Excellent. Well, thank you for indulging us as we get a little bit back on track and back on time. I'll make like a good pilot, try to make up a little time for us so that we can get things back into proceedings. But my hope is that every minute we spend here in the room will totally be worth it. So I think we've got most folks filtering in, coming back in. So we'll get to diving in. So hopefully everybody's here. This is the session on reviewing the 2019 Legal Trends Report. I've met many of the folks here in the audience. It's a pleasure to see you all again. For those that I haven't, my name is George Psiharis, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Clio. And one of the coolest and most exciting things that I get to do every year is present on this topic. To work with the team that builds our Legal Trends Report, this year represents our 4th annual report. Each year we've been building on insights from the last and deepening our explorations of the different topics that jump out to us and the different inquiries that make us curious. In 2019, I feel really strongly is our best ever report. We're going to dive into some deep stuff. Jack gave us a great walkthrough in his opening keynote this morning around some of the most important notes, and I'll do my best here to deepen everybody's understanding. How's that? A little better? A little louder? Good. Okay. So each year, we build on the findings from the last, but in every year, what we find is that this is a rare moment, a unique opportunity for the legal profession to, in some sense, step back, look at broader patterns, and in essence, see the forest from the trees. One of the things in my 9 years of experience working with legal practitioners to develop technology solutions is that it's a very fragmented space, right? Every year we find, from a demographic perspective, that 80% of law firms, 80% of the businesses or the practices in this vertical are in firms of 1 to 10 people. If you think of many other industries, they have Fortune 500, Fortune 5,000 companies. Legal is a little bit different. It is a fragmented professional services space full of a lot of smaller companies that provide a service, that provide professional advice. But what's really tough in that situation is to actually connect with broader patterns and to create peer networks or to know if what's going on in your day-to-day life as you go about practicing is mirrored in the broader trends or if the same thing is happening in firms across the board. And one of the truly unique things we get to do at Clio is serve some of that information back into the profession. And we need it for a variety of reasons. We need it to inform ourselves as a technology vendor on what products we can and should be building. And of course, we believe we have a role to play in creating the right conversations and explorations in the industry as well. And so one of those areas, one of those veins that we continuously mine year over year is what we often refer to as seeing, sizing, and seizing the opportunity in legal. I thought Jack gave an absolutely electric overview of that this morning, where if we circle back to a concept that we spent time addressing in the past, we see the legal market of today and often cast our problems and things that we need to improve within this vein. But when we do so, we often overlook what we call this kind of below the waterline or latent legal services market opportunity. And as we've referenced in the past, a recent study by the World Justice Project found that 77% of legal matters did not receive legal advice abroad, and that applies both in the domestic United States market, but actually globally as well. And quite often, we refer to this as the access to justice gap, and we cast it as a problem primarily solvable through pro bono initiatives or through price, by making legal services cheaper, by making legal services more commoditized. I think there's a certain part of this iceberg to which that applies below the waterline, but it's not the story for all of it. And this has been a year-over-year enduring opportunity for us to explore more in the Legal Trends Report. An example of that is what we often refer to as this chasm in expectations between lawyers and clients. They enter a process looking to exchange, but often have very different expectations of what did happen and what should happen in their experience. And of course, our goal is to deliver technologies and recommendations that help bridge this gap, but to also provide the insights that can encourage everyone to make progress on the things that matter to them. And what are some examples of where these gaps from previous years have been identified? Last year, we did extensive surveying where we compared what lawyers expected from the process and thought their clients wanted to what clients reported that they wanted as part of a process. There were many, many answers to this, but I just picked out one example to refresh everyone's memory or encourage folks to check out reports from previous years. One example was, how would you like to tell a lawyer all the facts and details of your situation? And this is one of those moments where insights not only kind of help us find the way, but they also surprise us and come back with things that I would consider largely unexpected. In comparison, most lawyers said that they expected overwhelmingly phone and email to be the mediums of exchange where people wanted to report the facts or details of their situation. Of course, that applies broadly to many different types of legal practice. Consumers overwhelmingly stated, and 70% of them said, they wanted to meet and do this step in person. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but consider that in this moment, someone is expecting to kind of have a person, have human empathy in dealing with a problem. And what they're getting is a different medium of exchange, a different method of communication that they didn't expect. And from there, you can kind of see how all these little things kind of add up to a rift in what someone's experiencing, what they expect. Once you also understand the problem, having very time-consuming in-person interactions might not only be the only solution, right? There could be other ways of delivering what someone's expressing that they need, but it challenges you to innovate and to think differently, but also think in a very targeted way in solving the problem. Of course, another year-over-year enduring observation that we have is on law firm performance and lawyer efficiency. So in previous years, as this year, we've observed that if we assume there's an 8-hour workday for a typical practicing lawyer, on average, 2.4 of those hours get utilized. That means 2.4 of those hours get put toward billable work in the first place. Furthermore, 1.9 hours in total get realized. That is to say, they end up on an invoice that a client ever sees, and 1.6 hours get collected. This is a really important last step. It might not seem like a lot going from 1.9 to 1.6 hours, but keep in mind, these are things that you've worked for, invoiced for, have served to clients, and are still not getting paid on in full, with bad debts and other examples coming up. And so that journey has kind of led us to many of the things we thought about in putting together the 2019 version of the Legal Trends Report. And above all else, our conference theme is to thrive. I think a lot of the time we can look at these insights and kind of go on this like bad news train where we end up like, oh my God, we suck at everything. I don't want that for everybody in the room, for anyone in the room. What these represent are tremendous opportunities to improve. And when you're thinking about improving, it's really helpful to have a roadmap that targets you on where to look and where to try stuff versus throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. It's a very inefficient process and not one that most folks who practice in law firms of 1 to 10 people can afford to take. And so that's our goal, and if we apply that to the kind of seeing the forest from the trees example, what I'd like to invite everyone to do, what my commitment is to try to do a walkthrough where we find these opportunities to level up and stand apart from the rest of the crowd. That's what this stuff is all about. It's all about finding that next level and doing the simple, very addressable things that translate into huge opportunities and huge outcomes. So that's my own scorecard of my performance for this presentation. We'll see how we do. And so to begin, I think what I'd like to do is open up with a bit of a guided tour of the Legal Trends Report. If Jack just gave us kind of the really fast drive-by, I'm going to try to take some stops and look around at the scenery as we go through. But even so, we're not going to have time to review all of the insights in the report this year. The other thing I'll mention is I always see people frantically trying to get this information down. But remember, the report's available for free. You can download it any time. And I'd encourage everyone to try to kind of maybe soak in my commentary if it's applicable, and some of the ways of articulating this stuff, and focus on rereading the report later to see what other findings that might be interesting to them. You're not going to get it all down. I dare you to try. So we're going to do this in 3 stops. The first is law firm growth. So as we saw earlier today, a little bit of a deep dive into what does thriving look like? What does that mean? I think it's easy for us to kind of suggest it aspirationally. We got a cool tech conference with a really different vibe from most legal conferences, but what does that mean? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to everybody who's in legal practice? The second is deep diving again into that client expectation stage. So what are those unmet needs that present the opportunities that we've highlighted many times, and how can we get specific and more informed about them as we go along? And then finally, we're going to revisit that part about putting the law firms to the test. There were so many fascinating findings from reaching out to firms in market and really understanding how client expectations and experiences that are being reported compared to what we were able to research and find in today's product, as Jack framed the product market fit issue in the legal services marketplace. So do those 3 stops. Hopefully this sounds good. What do you think? Those are good ones? All right. It's a lot of data, so we got to try to take some energy breaks, maybe do some jumping jacks. We'll see. I'll think about it. So part 1, the law firm growth study. So here's some things we thought about in this particular piece. We commissioned a survey, as we've done in previous years, of over 2,500 practicing lawyers. And some of the insights we gleaned to open up the survey really got us in the headspace of what folks were thinking about. One of our questions for them was, what does thriving, what does success look like for you? 87% of lawyers said that they agreed that they wanted their firms to grow in the next 3 years, and 67% said they wanted to grow more than a little. So obviously growing your firm is important. That's the scorecard. 76% of lawyers said they felt overworked, and 68% said they felt underappreciated. So let's consider that kind of head-on collision for a moment. The most important thing to me is to grow. I also feel very overworked. So it's not a just, bang your head against the wall kind of problem. It's not a simple solution, right? It's not just a matter of working harder. That's certainly never the way we would interpret the utilization rate data that we look at year over year. And on the bright side, the majority stated that they loved being a lawyer, and even more stated that they really loved working with clients. There's a deep passion for the profession, for the service, the advice that's provided. These are kind of the things swirling around that create these circumstances around where can we innovate, where can we improve. And in terms of that first topic of growing the firm, we dug deeper into that and asked, what does growth mean to you? When you say growth, what is the scorecard that you're assessing it by? And overwhelmingly, folks reported that growing their revenues was what mattered most. I recognize that that's not everybody's goal. That's not where every legal practice is at. But of a sample size of 2,500 respondents, over 70% said, my top thing is I need to grow revenue. We looked at a few other factors as well. We had people rank their top 3 choices of things that they wanted to grow and what growth meant to them. Overwhelmingly, as we stated, it was revenue. But we also looked at growing their client base and helping more people, hiring more lawyers, adding more non-lawyers to the firm, expanding their number of practice areas, and coming in at the bottom there is expanding their geographic location, so perhaps opening another office. I think what's interesting in those is many of them are drivers of ending up in growing revenues in an expanding firm. But that's what's in a lawyer's headspace, it seems. The typical legal practitioner, that is, not every lawyer, when it comes to what do I want to do? Like, what am I trying to get to here, and what's the key first stop? Another interesting part that we chose to add this year to the survey was education and experience. So we asked a question around how many people felt really comfortable with the subject matter, sort of the confidence in their ability to be a lawyer, versus how many people felt confident in their ability to run a business. And this is really interesting. Unsurprisingly, of course, 92% of lawyers felt really good about their ability to be a lawyer. But by comparison, only 53% said they felt confident with the business aspects of their practice. And we asked a variety of questions around what type of training they may have received and how that impacted their ability. So obviously, people in this red bar here reported not getting any training in business and feeling the least confident about business, which is perhaps unsurprising. I'm an MBA myself and know that anybody who's done an MBA would either feel confident or just lie and say that they did. Just because they feel they have to, because they paid for an MBA. Anyway. So another really interesting finding from that part of the survey was, where do you spend your time among the many things that can consume it outside of being a legal practitioner? So we had a few categories: consultations, office management, networking, marketing, etc. Most of them came in similar, like people who were confident on the business side and weren't were kind of landing in the same place, with 2 exceptions. The first was marketing. So people who felt more confident in their ability to run their business reported spending their time on marketing more often. And the second was long-term financial planning. Pretty businessy aspects of where people are spending their time, but an interesting observation for us in terms of where to look. Where are the insights that we're hoping to find? And that got us into a study that we've seen some insights from already, but that I'll spend some time on again as well, and that is, what does law firm growth, given that revenue is the primary definition of growth for all of us, really look like? And what we mean by actually look like is not aspirationally, not from a survey, but in the field, from practicing firms and how they perform. As Jack mentioned already, this was influenced by Jim Collins' highly influential book on Good to Great. We didn't do exactly the same type of study, but it was kind of inspired by some of that level of thinking. And it saw us dive into 5 years of Clio data. So one of the benefits of doing this report year over year is not just being able to report what happened in each year, but to go back and look at multiple years of data and see how did people trend over time. We report these overall averages, but who's moving around in what directions, and do we have big enough groups within that population to aggregate, anonymize, and report data insights as we do? And so that created what we refer to as far as we can tell, the first longitudinal study of the legal profession in history. I have never seen any kind of set of insights published like this for year-over-year benchmarking and seeing how different firms perform over time. And if you can't tell, I'm really excited to be able to present on it today and to have gotten to work with an amazing team to put it together. So, where did we begin? Well, we took that law firm scorecard, the revenue that people had in mind, and divided, as we've seen, into 3 categories. Those were firms that were growing. Those are the category of firms where they had to be growing by at least 20% over this 5-year period to be included. We had firms that were stable, so they didn't go over or under in any given year by 20%. and there were firms that were shrinking. These were firms whose revenues declined by at least 20%, but obviously could have been much more over that period. And we assigned them to these 3 cohorts over that 5-year period. And as we've seen, there were some really interesting findings. I'll quickly glance through them again just so that we can understand the gravity of them. So for the growing firms, the average firm in this category grew their revenues by 112% over this 5-year period. They saw client growth at 57%, matter growth almost identically, and to a lesser extent, lawyer growth. So that was kind of one of the things that jumped off the page to us. Our revenues are growing, but the number of lawyers we're hiring and employing at these firms isn't growing linearly with that. It's more than just adding more people and throwing more bodies at the problem. There's something else, right? There's more taking place behind this impressive and incredible growth that we're seeing. In stable firms, we saw revenue stay basically flat, like 0% growth over this 5-year period. Client growth slightly up, 1%, but pretty negligible. A decline in the number of matters they worked by 1%, and interestingly, still a bit of a decline in the number of lawyers at these firms. So they decreased by about 5% going into the year 2017. And for shrinking firms, we kind of saw the inverse of what we saw with growing firms. That is, their lawyer count declined by 17%, but their revenue declined by 54% overall as an aggregate. So in the same way that we see more revenue per lawyer happening in the growing firms, we see significantly less revenue per lawyer happening in what we identified as shrinking firms, which again tells us there's something more going on in this dynamic system below the waterline than perhaps meets the eye. And it especially stands out when we kind of stack them all next to each other and do a comparison. You can see that the revenue growth curve and the revenue decline curve are a lot steeper than any other things driving them. And so that got us back to thinking about the lawyer funnel again. The numbers for 2018 that we looked at in aggregating that data set and publishing in 2019 are very similar. 2.5 hours per lawyer average utilized, 2 hours realized, and 1.7 collected. I realize that not all of these stats are highly familiar to everyone, so I'll take a quick second just to re-explain exactly how these all work. So if we assume an 8-hour workday, which at best is an estimate, we don't know how much time everybody works, but when we do survey lawyers, we find most report target 8-hour workday, especially for billables. We tend to see 31% of that time, on average, put toward billable work. So stuff that you could ever charge for at all. The second step we refer to as realization rate. That is, of that work that you've done that you consider billable, how much of that ends up on an invoice that a client sees. So if you take that step and you mark it down thinking they're going to freak out if they see that bill, this is the step where that goes missing. That came in at 81%. And finally, collection rate. This is where you've put work on an invoice, you've priced it, you've charged for it, you've sent it to the client. But remember, you're still not collecting 100% of those amounts. There are bad debts, there are people who just never pay and get back to you, of course. And on average, we found that to be 86%. Across the industry. And while that might seem like the highest grade on the scorecard at 86%, keep in mind for me, that's like the stiffest gut punch, because this is work that you've not only done and expected to be paid for, it's work that you're not getting paid for, even 14% of that, right? And I meet many practitioners, I've met many practitioners over the years who kind of conflate what they have on their receivables with what they made, and this adds attrition that can really catch up to you in that step. So we look at all this stuff and think our job is to help make our customers better at all of these things. And we need to come up with innovative solutions. We also need to learn from everybody and engage in this conversation. So what the next step took us to was, what if we break out these stats into these cohorts that we identified, as we saw earlier today? Some really key takeaways. Realization and collection were never perfect. Even for growing and stable firms, there's always attrition that's going to happen there. I think the trick is keep them steady. Keep them at a level that's acceptable and that you can live with. And if they kind of decline from that, that's your anomaly, right? That's your red alert where you're like, okay, something's changed. I need to fix that part of my business once I get it to an acceptable level. And those came in at around 90% on both fronts. So don't aim for perfection and don't budget for perfection. I think the big takeaway for us was this utilization rate piece. So what we didn't expect was that the growing firms and the shrinking firms basically started in the same place over this 5-year period. They both came in around 28%, so a little bit below that 31% overall global average that we saw, with many stable firms already being higher and kind of chugging along, staying higher as far as their utilization rate goes. But they ended up in 2 dramatically different places. Now this axis on this chart only goes from 20 to 34, right? It doesn't go from 0 to 100. We've magnified it so that it's easier to see. But it speaks to the fact that even over this 5-year period, getting utilization from 28% to 33% for growing firms drove this crazy accretive impact. It's not a game of saying, okay, I'm at 25, I need to get this thing up to 80%. That is kind of like this huge impossible task. But what jumped off the page to us was tiny increments of getting more revenue per lawyer, and of course adding lawyers as well, but the increments of adding more revenue per lawyer changed the game for these firms in very meaningful ways. And that to me is a bit of a snowball effect, because if you can get in the habit of increasing your revenue and increasing your utilization rate a little bit each year, it snowballs into something that is incredibly sustainable and a long-term growth story, provided that that is what is important to you. And I think that those are the types of nuggets we look for in doing this data analysis to then challenge ourselves and the profession to say, how do we get there? Something else that was interesting, we looked at hourly billable rates as well. So overwhelmingly, we do see the prevalence of fixed fees and other arrangements, but overwhelmingly the revenue processed through Clio is hourly billables. What I thought was really interesting was everybody's rates are fairly flat. So these rates are just mostly adjusting for inflation, the prices of other things year over year. The shrinking firms actually had slightly higher rates, not huge in terms of difference, but they had slightly higher rates in terms of what they were charging. So we didn't see a ton of difference or raising your rates or changing them around, making a huge impact in this analysis, which I thought was very interesting. So we saw some insights and differences in some areas, and we saw some things that looked pretty much the same and consistent and steady in other areas that I think we might consider a lever. I think a lot of people consider hourly billable rates and price something that they can tweak in order to change their growth rate, but it didn't seem to be the case in our study. And as we saw earlier, this got us into thinking about expressing these concepts in a certain way. This brought us to what we have coined and published as a law firm maturity model. So this is a 2x2 axis where we consider firms can develop across the axis of firm performance. So this is utilization rate, realization rate, how am I performing from a financial perspective? And the other axis here is client experience. We think there are very different tactics, things that you can do to develop along these lines, but what grids like this really help with, and you see them a lot in the consulting world, 2x2 grids are always the classic tool. They just help articulate pain that you probably already feel or improvements that you feel you can make and make them tangible. So we feel really strongly that this is helpful, and of course we use this as a frame to understand what products we build and where they fit into helping people thrive. So altogether, when we say, like, let's come together at the conference and thrive, these are not the only ways to do so, but we feel that these are two really helpful ways to articulate ways that we can. Okay. I'm a big believer in the rule of threes, so you're going to see like lists of three coming up over and over again. Apparently, this helps people grasp information. We'll see how we do. Here's my first list of three. So 3 key takeaways from this first portion. I thought it was very interesting that higher billable rates did not guarantee or even correlate with sustained revenue growth. It's a small one, but a big one, I think, in terms of impact and the way many practitioners think about growing their firms. A second one was that the fastest growing law firms have realization and collection rates that are stable, but not perfect. I don't think the goal is ever to get those things to 100%. It seems like in practice, you're always going to have some attrition that happens. It's more about get it to a level that you're comfortable with and keep it under control. And of course, the big one was even incremental changes. Remember, over 5 years, these firms took their utilization rates from 28 to 33%. So they increased in relative terms by around 16, 17% over those 5 years. That led to revenue growth of 122% on average, like over doubling your revenue in that 5-year period. And I just think that is an incredible reminder of the power of what this utilization rate story really represents. And I think it was very interesting to validate that data point, that what we often call a WTF moment that we published in the first Legal Trends report, with seeing firms actually excel in doing this in the real world. Okay, so that brings us to the second part. Rule of three, there are 3 parts. See what I did there? Which is the unmet client expectations in the space. So on that client experience axis, there are a number of key takeaways that we hear reported to us, and this is the second year in a row where we've done this type of consumer market survey where we talk to 2,000 consumers. This is a mix of folks who have had a legal issue and worked with a law firm, but also folks who haven't or are possibly in the process of thinking about it. So a mix of folks who have and haven't engaged with a lawyer. And we asked them a few questions and really zeroed in on a few things we were most curious about this year. The first was, how do you shop for a lawyer? When you're looking around, what are the specific things that you do that you can recollect, and what is your process? The second was, what do you look for and expect as you make your decision? Like, what are you concerned with as you're like, okay, I'm going to pick? What are you thinking about in that particular stage of the process? And of course, the critical one for us was, where were those expectations, if applicable, met, and where were they missed? And it's interesting to see kind of what people remember as well from the process, what stood out to them the most. And so just to refresh on a couple of these insights, 59% said their first step was seeking a referral. 57% said they searched on their own. So that'd be I started Googling, I was looking at directories, I'll break those down in a moment. Only 16% reported doing both, which I thought was really interesting. I tried one, didn't get anywhere, I switched to the other one, and vice versa. I thought that was really interesting. Most people will pick a channel, keep going at it until they find someone, and find someone who finds it meets their expectations. And I think it'd be very interesting for folks to assess what applies to their practice the most. Where are people finding you from? Are they going through referrals? Are they primarily going through other channels? And does that change with the type of client that I acquire? In terms of breaking those categories down a bit further, so on the referral side, we certainly saw the vast majority of folks get a referral from a friend or a family member, so what you consider a close personal connection. A bunch got a referral from a lawyer, and a smaller group got a referral from a non-legal professional. That could be a CPA or something to that effect. A broader set of categories applied to looking on your own, so this would be going directly to a website, obviously doing online search engines, reviews. I'm a little surprised people still use phone books, but they did. Lawyer directories, so that'd be things like Avo, and of course, different types of content, including advertising that's produced and put out by the firms, but a little bit more distributed in terms of what people recollected that they were doing in their process. Going back to a few more insights related to this, so we mentioned this, only 16% of those who sought a referral first flipped and then started looking around on their own. So it seemed like there's this opportunity to get them and to keep them, and then a small percentage of them will move on to the second step. Very similarly, on the inverse, only 17% of people who looked on their own first kind of gave up and switched to asking for a referral, which again, I think speaks to this opportunity for a first mover advantage when it comes to response times. Over 50% of clients said they shopped around, that is to say that they contacted at least one lawyer or more and got a second inquiry responded to. 44% of them believed that they needed to contact multiple lawyers to find someone who was good. But interestingly, 42% said that if they liked the first lawyer they talked to, they're good. So they enter the process thinking like, I probably need to contact a couple people, but if the first lawyer I talk to doesn't suck by my definition of sucking, I'll probably just go with them. So I hope everybody's picking up what I'm trying to put down here, which is even if people enter the process with certain expectations, they don't necessarily leave them in the same frame of mind. Like just because somebody says, oh, I'm going to talk to 2 lawyers, doesn't actually mean they will. They will if you give them a reason. And I think that's a really important takeaway from this particular section of the Legal Trends report. In terms of ranking different factors, so that whole like pick your top 3 choices in different categories, we did that here as well with what's most important to clients. So this is where they shared with us the top #1 choice was a timely response, but there are a few other very important factors that were identified. They wanted the responses they got to be easy to understand. They wanted to understand the overall process, so the legal process and how that would work. They wanted to know next steps. They wanted answers to each question they asked. I think a thing that can very easily be overlooked. And of course, they perennially want expectations of cost. What am I signing up for, and what would the overall cost of this enterprise be? Coming in less significant, but still valid, friendly tone, and getting a meeting request set up very quickly. What I find interesting here is, yes, time to response is by far, like, I want somebody to get back to me, especially when I'm in this moment where I feel the pain. I'm like, oh, I got a lawyer up. Whatever the discipline is, like, you want somebody to get back to you in that moment. I can understand that. The next 4 examples here, they'll all fit into this category for me of I want to understand how this is going to work. Like, I want things that are clear, that I can understand. I don't want surprises. Like, they're looking for information. Despite them being different response categories, they have a similar thread to them, which is I want to be informed. I want to know what's going on. And again, I don't think any of the practitioners I've met intentionally don't seek to inform their clients at a level that's appropriate for their inquiry. But I do think it's the kind of thing where if it's not front of mind for you, you can overlook it and think of it as a small detail, like not answering every question that's laid out and maybe answering 1 or 2 of them, but that actually has a really big impact on that person's likelihood to think, this is the lawyer for me, or I'm gonna like go back and find another one. On that topic of expected response time, so the most common expectation reported, around 50% of respondents said they expected a response within 24 hours. But if we tally up the people who said within 1 hour, within a few hours, we actually see that overall, if you don't get back to them in 24 hours, you missed almost 80% of people's expectations overall. And that's something to keep in mind. So 80% of people are expecting you to get back to them by then. As Jack pointed out, again, I don't think this is commentary from us that lawyers are like staring at the phone, being like, screw you phone, I'm not gonna pick you up, I don't want more business. It's pretty clear that there are many other demands of the role and the job that pull you in different directions. And this is where the light bulb goes off for us that says, this is a place where technology and process can help. Let's get to work. Let's help figure out this problem and create an opportunity here for people to stand above the rest of the forest, so to speak. I think the other thing that I can't call it enough is that over and over again, we heard that people just wanted simple, understandable, but also more information about this part of the process. So a few examples. 81% wanted a response to each question they asked. 80% said it's important to have a clear understanding of how to proceed. So in a classic sales and marketing world, you might hear this referred to as a call to action. Like whenever you go to a website, there's always some button like right in your face. It's like, click, buy, do something, like that next step. Often we leave clients hanging without an understanding of what that is, even if we do respond to them, right? And that's information on what to do next. How do I proceed? 76% also want to get a clear sense of how much their legal issue will cost. I think to no one's surprise. 74% want to know how the full process will work for their case. And I think all of these things kind of bridged together and brought us to the point where we wanted to ask, okay, that's your laundry list of expectations. One other thing, actually, I shouldn't forget to call out is that almost all the respondents said all of those things mattered to them. It wasn't like one thing mattered more than the rest, but all of these things are highly important to me. Now, how do they think lawyers are doing for those that have been through the process? You know what comes next? Not great. 64% said they contacted a firm that never replied, and for those that did, they reported a few facts. So 65% didn't get that call to action. They didn't get any, they may have gotten a reply, even if they did. They didn't know what they were supposed to do next. Again, I look at that and I think 1% dial on the utilization rate, get a couple more clients by just telling them what to do next, bam, priority problem solve. And not some earth-shattering, like huge lift that I think would be unapproachable to everyday legal practitioners. With that said, it takes work and commitment and attention to a specific focus area. 64% didn't get a sense of how much their case would cost. 62% said they didn't understand the process for their case. A similar number said they didn't get enough information that they could understand. So I want to emphasize that point too. There's a difference, of course. This is literally my challenge today, right? Is I can go through all this data in a pile, but if I can't help you understand it, we're no good, right? Like we're not going to get the advancement that we expect to see. And in a similar sense, even for folks who did get answers to their questions, they often found them a little bit difficult to understand. Tough process, but also something that's on their mind that's worth thinking about. 52% said that they spoke with a lawyer that wasn't likable or friendly enough. I'm sure that's no one in this room. I'm sure people talk to me all the time and think the same. So, key takeaways from this section, our next kind of rule of three breakdown. First, I think it's pretty clear that consumers either get a referral or they try it out on their own and sometimes do both, but if they're doing one or the other, be there. Like that's your opportunity to grab them. Overwhelmingly, again and again, they were looking for two things. If we can narrow this down into like two things to keep front of mind, responsiveness and clear and easy to understand information. I think those are two things that, I want to say you can upgrade them for free, but like there are ways to use tools and also even mindset shift to perhaps emphasize these things if you find that they resonate with your clients as well. And I think in their eyes, shopping for a lawyer does leave much to be desired. Like it's not a solved problem. It's not a fixed process. Compared to the other consumption experiences that they have in their daily life, like this one feels a little different, feels a little more difficult. And I think that presents an opportunity. It might often seem as a roadblock or something that's like structurally broken in the profession, but it's not true. What I think it presents is an easy opportunity to excel. I shouldn't say easy, but a straightforward opportunity to excel for those that are interested and to stand apart from the rest of the pack. Okay, and then we got to this section of the analysis, which was putting 1,000 law firms to the test. So we thought, okay, we've understood what lawyers want to achieve, what their level of confidence is perhaps in their ability on that business and revenue driving side, what the best law firms out there are doing in terms of their performance, or at least have some takeaways of what's different about what they do. And we've also dug into clients, their expectations, and how they believe we're performing. So now, let's put it all to the test. Let's get some real-world tests of what's going on out there and be able to speak with a little bit more source data, if you will, as opposed to what people are remembering happening in the process from surveys by going through this process. We can share a personal anecdote. Has anybody ever been through this thing called a DEXA scan? Anybody? This doctor I go to recently had one of these things installed in his office, and basically it scans your body like inch by inch for what seems like an eternity, and then reports back to you basically your entire body mass index and how it's all distributed throughout your body. And I described this to my wife as knowing more about myself than I've ever wanted to know. I went through a bit of a process. I got angry with the doctor, I got angry with the machine, this is bullshit, like all this stuff, and then I realized, I mean, it's all true, I should probably make some changes. And I feel like some of that discomfort that I felt, and if you're looking at me thinking like, I don't know, you look fine, no, this scan will show you something you never knew about yourself, I promise. Don't do it. Anyway, I expect some of that same like similar discomfort that I felt when I went through that with some of the folks in the room when they look at these results, right? I think it almost seems unfair, you know, to have gone through that process. What I think is really, really important and to consider is it's also unique and a level of insight that we've never had before. And I think it can be really, really applicable. And in terms of thinking of comparables, this is actually something that, again, is very common in the broader business world. Going through a customer buyer's journey and mapping it and understanding what it's like. In retail, since the 1940s, a lot of people kind of go shop and test the processes and the experience in the stores to understand what that process is like from the buyer's perspective. This has been going on for a long time. Of course, going back to this idea of fragmented law firms all being, 50% of the profession solos, 80% of 1 to 10, how many folks have the resources or the time to go through a process like that? And this is where we can aggregate, contact 1,000 firms, and report back to what we're finding. And establish some benchmarks on performance as well. What is it actually like? Are you performing up to snuff, or are you a very different experience as well? So that's my take on why you should be comfortable with these insights that we're going to walk through and why they're a win, not something to get uncomfortable about. So in building our sample, I wanted to comment a bit as well on how we selected these firms. They're all based in the US, and we focused primarily on 5 areas of inquiry. Those were family with a child custody inquiry, criminal with a domestic abuse charge, bankruptcy, employment, and business with an incorporation matter, respectively. So we focused on these 5 areas. Couldn't do them all, obviously, and wanted to have lots of comparables in these different areas. Some additional criteria as well. The firm had to have an active web presence where we could review and find contact information with publicly accessible contact information. That includes emails and phone numbers. And finally, they had to have information that indicated that they handled this relevant issue type. We obviously didn't want to reach out to firms who didn't handle this issue type. Of course, we're not going to expect high levels of response or really informative responses. The other thing I'll mention as well is we did ask the firm that we work with to take deliberate effort not to waste people's time. So it was one inquiry, one email, one phone call, and leave it at that, not a repetitive, time-consuming process as well. And we think that I'm kind of curious if any firms in the room were actually part of it. We wouldn't know because it's all anonymized, but I think the vertical is confined enough that there's some likelihood that folks are both in the survey and in part of the test of the 1,000 law firms. So Jack's already walked us through some of these things. I expect they'll be just as eye-opening the second time around. Here we go. As we've discussed, 60% never responded to the email that we sent at all, despite some matching criteria being put in place where we're inquiring with a matter that looks like it's a fit for your practice. Of those that did, 29% provided a response that was timely, clear, and answered not all, but at least one question that was phrased in the email. And what we published in the Legal Trends report that you'll get your eyes on later, I'm sure, are some scorecards that evaluate how people performed. I think this one's really, really interesting. So for anyone who's doing the quick math, these don't add up to 1,000 because remember, 600 of the firms never got back to us at all. Within the ones that did, we used those criteria that we identified in surveying consumers to assess how did we do against those expectations and tried to be as technical as we could. So some examples, to be in this excellent category, you had to respond within 24 hours. You had to provide advice that we considered professional and courteous. It had to be clear and easy to understand. You had to answer all the questions. And there had to be that detailed information on what to do next, and also some kind of estimate on cost. Out of 1,000 law firms that we emailed, 2 got back to us and checked all these boxes for 0.5% total of total respondents. I kind of want to find those two and give them an award. Maybe we can add them to the reasons, but it is inspiration for our client experience category. But I think that speaks to the opportunity to excel. We're not talking about a huge volume of firms that have figured this out, but if we can, it's a truly unique opportunity. At that, 20 firms responded with responses that we consider good, and most were adequate or unsatisfactory. And so digging in deeper to those 40% of firms that did respond, some additional observations. So 58% overall had what was assessed as a likable tone. 57% provided information that was clear and easy to understand, if not all of the questions or information. 28% provided clear next steps. 27% provided information on rates or overall cost. An identical number referenced similar situations, so I've dealt with this type of issue before and can help you. And only 13% provided information on what to expect from the legal process. So it's interesting, right? Like, where are the biggest gaps and the biggest places to stand out if someone is contacting multiple firms? So there's getting back to them very quickly, a challenge in and of itself, but also there's getting back to them in the right way. And I think this is a really cool scorecard with insights on where to differentiate a bit and where to provide excellent client service. And again, this is stuff that's very aggregated. It cuts across a lot of practice areas. So I'd encourage everyone to think about the relevance level. Like, does that apply to my clients? Does that apply to my practice? It depends. This is overall, right? The forest, not the individual tree, so to speak. So 53% of those that responded requested that we call them instead, as we saw earlier. We had 500 phone calls, 56% of law firms answered our calls, and 39% went to voicemail. A few disconnected because the numbers didn't work. For those 56% that did answer our calls, we thought that the general finding was that phone performance was better than email, but also had significant opportunity to improve. So 56% provided rate information. For example, do I do an hourly model or do some kind of alternative fee arrangement? 9% provided an overall cost estimate, and 43% said I wouldn't talk rates over the phone at all. So again, if I'm the client expecting this information, this gives me kind of an out. It gives me that cause to go pursue a second step or to shop around for a lawyer. 50% explained the legal process and indicated next steps, so significantly higher over the phone versus by email. 49% answered most of the questions asked, though only 11% would answer questions. Sorry, I'll phrase that a different way. 11% would only answer questions in a follow-up appointment. Thank you for calling me, so I've emailed you. Okay, call me. Okay, now I'm not going to answer any questions until you come in, which again kind of creates this opportunity for the conversation to deteriorate. 11% over the phone referenced case examples with contextual information as well. And so if we break that into a scorecard, we thought that of the firms that we did get in contact with, 20 or so provided excellent service, so 7%, 26 provided good, and 62 firms for 22% provided adequate information overall. So significantly better once we talk to the client versus conversing with them in writing. And for this last one, I just would say voicemail is, that's all I'm going to say. Okay, I'll explain further. We found that in trading voicemails and trying to communicate and share, like live up to these client expectations via voicemail, 4% of firms, or 3 overall, give adequate responses, and the rest were unsatisfactory. So perhaps the lesson there is consider the way you're going to use your voicemails. Like, they're effectively a recorded message like an email, so I don't see a reason why they should be so different, one versus the other, but they certainly ended up being dramatically different in the information that was conveyed by the law firm reaching back out and leaving a voicemail with the client. Okay, our next rule of 3, the 3 wrap-up items from that section. I feel that the consumer reports of poor response times and their expectations not being met were entirely validated, right, in the experience. Around the same number of consumers who reported not receiving a response, we saw the same experience in putting law firms to the test and reaching out to them. If we use consumer expectations as a scorecard, I would say it's not unfair to say that shockingly few firms, 2 out of 1,000 on the email side, provided excellent responses to those inquiries, or even ones that I'd consider passable. And I just think there's a tremendous opportunity to consider how you can excel and improve just by focusing on that one particular piece. But ultimately, I think the takeaway here is it shouldn't surprise us, right? There's so many obstacles that come up in the profession, in the way that it works, that prevent you from being able to be responsive, or perhaps even as descriptive, take the time to craft a good response as you might want. And that's not the point. The point isn't that like everybody needs to do better. The point, I think, is that people need to think about solving these things in different ways than they have in the past, because consumer expectations are migrating. They're not staying static, and they're certainly not what they were in the past. Okay, so with the guided tour kind of completed, I think it's a good juncture to wrap up the talk today with a bit more of a forward-facing conclusion. What are some of the things that we think we can do? What are some of the things that we think we can implement? So I'm going to do like a ring that rules all the rest of the rings, a rule of 3 that stands above all the rules of 3 that we walked through so far. If you leave us with nothing else today from the overall report, even if you don't read the report, never think about it again, these are kind of my distillation of 3 things to make sure you take away. The first, the fastest growing firms are productive, but not the most expensive. I thought that really stood out to me as a takeaway, and conventionally not exactly what I find when I converse with the many people I get to meet in the profession in doing this job. The second really, really key takeaway was consumers shop around for lawyers, but when they do, being responsive and informative wins, and it also stops the shopping process. They're not hell-bent on shopping around and not trusting. It's more like, I didn't like what I heard, I'm going to try again. But that means there's opportunity to really capture that if you can identify what clients are a really good fit for you. And third, I think that chasm between lawyer perception and reality when it comes to real-world performance versus consumer expectations is still very real and still a place of much-needed progress. Don't forget, like, our own perception of how things are going and what people want is half the battle here, right? If we can inform ourselves with these insights, it actually immediately improves performance. And again, I want to tie it back to that incremental change, that 1% lift in our utilization rate year over year, combining into 122% revenue growth over a 5-year period, which I think most people would take. Like, yep, sign me up for that. I'd love my revenues to be over double what I do in 5 years, especially if I've been in practice for some time. And this brings us back to making use of the law firm maturity model. I think it's a simple concept, and yet it's an elegant one that can help us place where we're at, or also identify the axes that we want to make progress on. I think it's the kind of thing that if you paid a McKinsey consultant a ton of money to come into your firm, not disparaging the firm, of course, at all, they'd come up with something like this. This is the type of thing that encourages you to think about and say, okay, we're here. How do we think we're going to get here? And once we get here, how do we think we're going to get up into that quadrant where we really want to be and where we really want to thrive? Simple, but effective and tough to make the headspace for when you're doing a million things during the day. I can't emphasize enough as well as a concept that I talked about last year too, which is don't overwhelm yourself with the scale of change you want to make too. If some of this stuff resonates and you think, okay, I accept the insights, I want to action them, it does not have to be seismic shifts. I think Jack made the joke earlier today of like, pick up the phone, starting point. Maybe a little bit, more on the comical side, but like kind of true. Some of these changes aren't sweeping, big uncomfortable lifts. They're incremental, and I think the other part is you can accrue them over time. You can get in this habit of mindfully making improvements and think, okay, I made that one. What's the next little step I can take? And the one after that. I'm very excited this year to have seen us incorporated into our product roadmap and delivery as well. A few things that you saw earlier officially dropped, as we like to say in the industry, in the opening remarks today, but that I'll circle back on and emphasize as well. This is an example of how we too take the insights and challenge ourselves to think, okay, what are we going to do about this, right? This is what our product management team gets up and thinks about in the morning and does their best to work with engineering to execute on. So, non-billable time. I think this one, like, if you guys could use this and tell all your friends so that I could put it in the next legal trends report, that'd be amazing. Where are we spending our time? An incredible opportunity to do that in Clio, and a simple but effective tweak you might consider making to your workflow, where affiliated with a matter in particular, so even if you're doing it overall, it's great, but if you can associate it too with what clients and what matters you're spending your non-billable time on, we've added this ability to basically check and identify a time entry or some kind of billable amount, but then say it's non-billable. This is time I spent that was not something I could bill for. It's an extra step, like you gotta do it, but it helps give you the inputs you need to truly understand where your time is going, and then what tweaks you can make to drive that utilization rate back up if applicable. And it'll show you, even on the matter level, what the distribution is of your billable versus non-billable time in a matter you're working on for a client. And I think just having that even visible and something you can reflect on to then think about how are we going to do this better next time can be a true game changer. And it's simple. Again, not a huge, dramatic overhaul in terms of your workflow. And we're very excited to see that featured in the product. Just a quick zoom in as well on the breakdown between billable and non-billable. I'm doing pretty well in this case. Good to see. The other one, which I get asked for every year, is when are we going to be able to measure these KPIs in Clio? Well, now we can. The firm dashboard is finally here where the utilization rates, the realization rates, the collection rates you see us talk about are something you can track and report to yourself on behalf of your firm in the product. Very excited to see those in there. A quick overview of what that looks like. Literally, you'll go to your firm dashboard in Clio, and it'll report your overall utilization rate, your overall realization rate, and your overall collection rate in the app. As you scroll down and populate these different measures. And I think the other thing we've added that is really, really helpful is not only what is the aggregate amount, but how is this trending over different periods? How did I do in January? How did I do in February? Is this going up or is it going down? Is it staying steady? All super important things you need. It's almost kind of like the instrument panel on flying your plane. You know, how's my firm doing and how am I performing in these really crucial ways? No two firms are the same, but I think even benchmarking over your own performance and seeing if it's improving or declining is super important. On the utilization rate side, we'll also have the ability to personalize it a bit. So what is my intended utilization over the course of the day? Again, not everyone is working full time. Not everyone has an expectation of an 8-hour workday, perhaps. That'll be something that over time will be configurable in the product too. Another one that we spent some time on was the Clio scheduler. So I talked about this kind of like email responsiveness back and forth, and I think what's something that we can automate and make super quick and easy so that you can then apply yourself to thinking about the client experience, to being informative, to answering everybody's questions? This one to me jumps out as a no-brainer. As long as folks are comfortable setting certain blocks of time and making them available, and soon to come, as we mentioned, the payments feature that'll allow you to charge for consultations as people book them and get paid in advance. Super important and very, very impactful on utilization rate and driving much of the firm performance and the client experience as well that we've talked about in the law firm maturity model. Quick reminder to everyone, these will be in the Clio lab. So if you'd like early access to these products, you can go, or features rather, you can go access them in the Clio lab. It's a little tricky to find in the new setup, so it's back on the first floor near the lobby as we discussed when people check in, so a bit of a walk. But I do encourage everyone to make the trip and to experience these features, especially if they're part of the LTR fan club. This is your jam. You'll be all over this stuff. And then finally, we talked about this as well. On that collection rate side, Clio Payments or any online payment medium offers you this opportunity to just get paid, to remove the obstacle to getting paid and to chew into that 14% that we see roughly year over year that we think we're going to get paid for, but that we don't. And I can't think of a better, more compelling example than the data point that we produced in the Google Trends report this year, which was around 57% of these payments getting paid same day. You know, never mind net 30, never mind kind of offering people discounts to pay up front, like just bam, done, credit card in, got it out of my way. The people that are gonna pay, just get it out of the way faster. And I think that's just an incredible no-brainer, and the ROI on some of the processing fee stuff that folks are concerned about is, from an economics perspective, like not even worth talking about, right? That processing fee versus the 14% or the delay even that you're losing and getting your money back is a no-brainer, at least in my biased perspective. Jack mentioned as well the client-centered firm on that firm client experience access rather is available for pre-order. This is a book that Jack has put together based on many of these learnings over the years and is really, really centered on the client experience process. My goal every year in the talk is to make it a bit of a pep talk, not just like here's all the things we suck at to get better at. It's more like here's all the things I believe that all of us can excel at. But if my pep talk didn't do it, on a personal level, I will highly recommend going to Daniel Pink's talk. Daniel Pink is one of the foremost presenters on motivation, the science and theory of motivation. And one of the things I find really interesting is like it's one thing to provide the insights and to say here's the path forward, it's another to feel truly motivated to go and get this done. And if you find that's you, if you find you could use that boost, I highly recommend Dan Pink's talk today and even many of the materials that are available online. I think what was, or perhaps still is, the most watched TED Talk of all time. And I will mention, don't forget, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the report that we didn't cover today. Some quick examples. We every year map the billable hour index. So how much does the typical billable hour, what is the rate of the typical billable hour in the legal profession aggregated overall, and how does it trend over time? That is available in the Legal Trends Report. We take that and we slice it up by different geographies. So we do it by state and major metropolitan areas. So if you'd like to compare your rates to the many rates out there, you're welcome to do that in the report. And we adjust them for the cost of living to provide what are what we call the adjusted or real rates for the legal profession. Basically, where does your rate take you the farthest versus cost of living? And for the second year in a row, that's Nevada. So overall lawyer rates of $308, but when adjusted for the cost of living, $316 an hour, which came in tops in the country. We also divide a lot of this information up into different practice areas. So one stat that you can find of many that I'll point out is average case value by practice area. So if you'd like to see estimates or even what are called descriptive stats on how much money per case is collected in different practice area types, we have 30 commonly used practice area types in Clio that you can go check out. They're obviously a big read and a long list, so probably better done in the PDF versus me walking through them, but they're there, and I wanted to make sure folks knew that that information was available. You can go download the report anytime, clio.com/LTR, that's the short form for a Legal Trends Report. And hopefully, this is delivered on that promise, on that scorecard of mine. I'd love the feedback on how to make it better, but overall, my hope is that we have some real tangible insights here on how folks can stand apart from the rest of the pack. Before wrapping up, I would like to say as well, I'm often kind of like regarded as the LTR guy at Clio. That may have been the case 4 years ago, but as this study has expanded in scope and in breadth, it turned into like basically a full year-round effort of assessment. There's an amazing team that puts this report together. We have Bryce Tarling, who's our senior content strategist. We have Renee Duval, who's our designer and puts all of these beautiful graphs together. We have Fraser Newton, who's our director of data insights, who runs the data science team at Clio. And we have a partner, Nika Kabri, who helps us on a consulting basis with much of the consumer research that you see and the interesting findings. So on a personal level, I wouldn't mind a round of applause for these folks who do the hard lifting. It takes a village, and certainly it's a big lift to do the Legal Trends Report these days. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much. Hopefully you enjoyed the presentation. Enjoy the conference.